Okay, so I think we might as well get started because everyone is coming in. So first of all, I just want to say I hope everyone's got a beautiful morning where they are. Here in Tasmania, I think the spring has finally decided to start happening because we actually have sun. It's lovely. So good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to acknowledge that where I'm joining today is from Nipaluna Lutuwita, Hobart, Tasmania. This is the unceded country of the Muwinina people who didn't survive colonisation and the Palawa people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I extend this respect and acknowledgement to the countries across Australia from which you are joining and First Nations people. And of course, please feel free to share in the chat where you're joining from today. Just to remind everyone about just some protocols, just to make sure that you're on mute. We will have opportunities for questions later on. Depending upon how we go, we might do it in the chat or we might unmute microphones depending upon how we go. In case you don't know who I am, I'm Chair-Peta Cook, and it's a real pleasure today to chair this plenary, which is focused on working beyond academia in and outside of universities. Now, just to let you know that this plenary is designed to be discussive, a conversational style, and it features 5 sociologists who are all at different stages and different institutions and are working with a range of partners. So I'm going to introduce each of our plenary speakers now. So it's just going to take me a little while because they've all got very impressive biographies. So I'm really happy to have all of you here today. So first of all, Joseph Ball-Agden is a Principal Research Fellow at the Social Policy and Research Centre, Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. He leads the Youth Opportunity Team that conducts research and evaluation in the areas of youth employment, education and homelessness. Drawing on over a decade of working collaboratively at the nexus of research, policy and practice, he has refined I'm going to say this word wrong because I normally do, a systemic change methodology that applies social policy to intentionally disrupt systems that hold inequality and disadvantage in place. Joseph is passionate about the role of sociology in not only reframing social problems, but designing and proposing ways of addressing them. And Joseph served as the inaugural applied sociology portfolio leader on the TASA executive. Next, we have Karen Soldatic. He's Associate Professor, School of Social Sciences and Institute for Culture and Society, University of Western Sydney. Her research is within the field of disability studies and is driven by a rigorous commitment to disability distributive justice, participation and equality. Her work is internationally and nationally recognised for its theoretical, conceptual and methodological innovations within the field of critical disability studies and intersectionality studies, particularly in relation to her capacity to undertake highly rigorous, engaged and nuanced research in landscapes that have experienced high levels of social, environmental, political and economic distress and marginalisation. And next we have Catherine Carroll, and Catherine is a senior lecturer in the School of Sociology at the Australian National University. Catherine is an applied sociologist who works with the health sector to examine and transform how health services are experienced and delivered. She uses participatory, qualitative and visual research methodologies with research participants, health professionals, patients and caregivers. Her particular areas of interest include the sociology of reproduction and motherhood, perinatal medicine, and lactation sciences. Using video reflexive ethnography, Catherine works with health professionals to highlight and optimise the often hidden, underappreciated, or overlooked practices that constitute the successful delivery of healthcare. She is currently working on the topic of lactation after infant death, with the aim of improving health services for bereaved parents. In this project, she is working with bereaved families, health professionals, and perinatal health and bereavement advocacy organisations. So next we have Ricky Spencer, and Ricky is a qualified teacher and current student at the University of Melbourne and is completing their Master of Social Policy. They are a public advocate for people living with a disability, transgender and First Nation, whom are all important lived identities. Now, Ricky's really busy. Ricky is the elected Queer Greens Victoria convener and the Victorian Greens, also the Housing and Homelessness convener, co-convener for People with Disabilities Working Group and co-convener for Climate Change and Energy. Ricky is the current convener for Sociology of Media Thematic Group in TASA, elected LGBTIQ officer, University of Melbourne, LGBTIQ Community Housing Reference Group member for Housing for the Aged Action Group, Community Advisor member for the Consumers Health Forum Australia, and peer facilitator at Thorn Harbour Health. And Ricky has over 20 years experience working in welfare provision as a social worker and teacher. And lastly, we've got Vaughan Higgins, who's a professor of sociology in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania. His research encompasses the fields of sociology of agricultural and food, environmental sociology, economic sociology, and the sociology of science and technology. Informed by analytical approaches such as governmentality, actor network theory, and assemblage thinking, Vaughan's work is aimed at understanding how agri-food policy and programs are implemented in practice and made workable across a range of regional and industry settings. Vaughan's research has involved collaboration with a range of government agencies, industry bodies, and regional farming groups in Australia. So thank you everyone for joining the plenary. I hope everyone sees what a diversity of sociological interests and backgrounds that we have in the plenary. So I'm very excited by this session. So I'm going to start with a very broad question for all the plenary members, and that is, what is the purpose of your research, or if you like, the application of sociology?
Oh, anyone can jump in?
Anyone can jump in.
Oh, look, I'll just start. Well, thank you for having me. For me, I've been enlightened in recent years with some theory I found, and disruption theory, which really takes sociology with all its little beautiful ways of changing the world and into a praxis model that I apply in various organizations that I'm very passionate about. For me, it's about making sure all voices are heard, especially voices that are underrepresented and marginalized in our current society. So for me, sociology has given me a platform to understand how people interact with each other, and also the structural inequalities that are in place in terms of power, who has power, why does that particular person or group have power, and how do we redistribute that power so everybody has an opportunity to have a voice and have access to resources and services within a setting. So that's sort of like a snapshot for me. Over to whoever. Joseph.
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks for having me, Peter, and thanks to TASA. I guess the purpose of our research at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, so we sit in a fairly unique spot, I think. So we're outside of academia. We have an MOU with Melbourne University, and we have a very close working relationship with practitioners who are part of the same organisation, and also working with practitioners outside of the BSL as well. In our space, the purpose of our work is really, it's pretty lofty. We're quite ambitious. It's really around systemic change, so transforming systems so that they can enable young people to live a good life. We know that systems are often designed to manage social problems and to manage disadvantage rather than building young people's capabilities and using capabilities here in the Sen and Nussbaum sense. In terms of the application of sociology, for me, it's really been around having an understanding of what holds these big social problems in place. And the constant for me has been Bourdieu, and you can apply the dynamics of a field to almost any human services system and why they're so difficult to shift and transform. I think probably where sociology hasn't been as useful as probably I would like is in prosecuting solutions, designing solutions. I think there's a little bit of overlap. There are some sociologists like Monica Prasad in the States who talks about a solution-oriented sociology. But I think there's still a way to go with that. So I'm just going to put that one out there.
Greetings from Ngunnawal country, Canberra. And yeah, I'd like to talk about launching from what Joseph said about going into the particulars for engaging people in change. I guess my work in sociology is outside of academia is sort of twofold. One is methodological, and the other is more with regards to the topics and the type of things that I look at with people. So methodologically, particularly through participatory work, using video reflexive ethnography primarily. I engage in collaborative work with health services where we go in and we make decisions with health professionals mostly, but also patients and families about particular aspects of care provision that we'd like to examine and potentially optimise and change. And we do that by going in and engaging in filming of practices, and then looking as a group and doing collaborative sense making of that footage. And this process of watching one's complex practices in healthcare, how they are done, how they unfold in a very emergent and complex way, because healthcare is so dynamic and messy and interconnected, people start seeing their team's work and their own work in new ways, thanks to seeing it in front of them on a video screen and discussing that away from the hurly-burly of care provision with their colleagues, and then identifying aspects that they'd never seen before and engaging in a sort of problem-solving aspect where they sit and look and discuss and then work out how to do things better or what to optimise. And so that's been a really gratifying aspect, I guess, of sociological work, of going in and helping make connections through methodology. But the other aspect that I do with my health work is look at particular topics that might be researcher driven, where I start with a topic and I go out and make connections with people in healthcare, or people from healthcare might come to me. And some, I guess, two examples of that is for me, I'm working with Mayo Clinic on peri-viable decision making. So neonatologists, that is baby doctors, if you like, came to me and said, we want to improve our communication with having really complex discussions with parents who are midway through their pregnancy and they're about to give birth to an extremely premature baby who may or may not survive, and they have to make a decision in hours or days whether to undergo resuscitation of that baby or not. How can we work with these parents? How can we communicate better? So engaging in this sort of cross-disciplinary work on very difficult topics and shining a social science lens on that. And then a researcher-driven one is through my ARC grant, Australian Research Council grant, looking at lactation after loss. For me, it's challenging the norms of lactation, the norms of motherhood. What is motherhood when your child has passed away? What are norms of lactation that confront us in society when you continue to choose to lactate, for example, when you don't have a living infant? And for me, that's been going out into advocacy groups, into healthcare services and saying, this is what I'm interested in. Would you like to partner with me? And can we together work on this project?
I'd like to follow up from Catherine and Joseph and Rick. First of all, I want to recognise that I'm on the unceded stolen lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. For me, this is a really interesting discussion because I've always considered my work really to really fall into what American sociologists calls critical policy sociologies. And that's really, and I guess it also relates to what Joseph was suggesting about one of the problems with sociology in working in the applied space is this tension about being a sociologist from a critical paradigm that's engaging in questions of power and what our role actually is in that, and how do we facilitate or open out the space to engage with people working on the ground. For me, that's been particularly important because one of the things that I'm actually interested in is the way in which the nation state categorises individuals and what that actually means for their overall, structures of inequality, but what that actually means for their life course and their overall well-being. And I think this is what sociology actually enables us to do in working in the implied space. It's to reflect on policy critically, but also then to think about social structure and personal biography. So going back to, to the 50s to think about White Bill's work, where we're thinking about this dynamic and to also understand the way that people are not completely socially determined, but they have agency. So this for me, in terms of working in the applied space, is really coming back to my sociology, is to think about how can, with our sociological frameworks, actually not just give people voice around documenting their experience, but how do we use our critical sociological skills to build capacity with the communities that we're working with. And particularly, I'm particularly interested, and this is what for me sociology gives, is people who fall outside formalised paradigms of being stratified into a particular category, or the way in which the state creates new categories to capture new forms of inequality as things change over time. And I guess to give an example of that is at BSL with one of Joseph's colleagues, Dina Bowman, we recently did a public report that used critical sociological frameworks to really map out the way that social security has not only just generates, income inequality, but the way that it formally collapses social categories. So, but at the same time, within the legislation, what's occurring at the micro level is it's actually generating new kind of subcategories of who is defined as living in poverty. And this is what I think sociology actually brings to the applied space, is actually understanding the dynamics of the state as it's undergoing through significant change and trying to capture what those inequalities mean, not just structurally, not just fiscally or from a political economic perspective, but that interrelationship between personal biography and community and how and what that dynamic is.
What everyone else has just said has provided a really nice backdrop to what I'm about to say. So look, I guess as a sociologist working in the subdisciplinary area of the sociology of agriculture and food, I've always seen my research as being very much public focused, called a public sociology, I suppose. So I've engaged with concerns of government, industry, farming community, at the same time as, I guess, trying to ensure that I'm contributing to more sustainable and socially just rural futures as well. And I guess what I've done through my research is to focus this around two broad thematic areas. And the first of these is what I've called assembling neoliberal governing, and the second is program implementation and practice adoption. And I guess I've used these two thematic areas, which often overlap, of course, to focus my research in ways that balance making a scholarly contribution at the same time as addressing some key concerns from government and also farming industries as well. So I guess assembling neoliberal governing is really, for me, oriented towards making sense of how neoliberal rationalities and technologies of governing are assembled, but also made workable as well. And I guess a good example of that is in a current ARC project that I'm working on, how to improve Australia's shared responsibility approach to biosecurity. What we're doing in that project through qualitative research is documenting the mostly unrecognised practices that biosecurity stakeholders at state and regional scales are using to coordinate with one another to work around ongoing cutbacks to staffing and resources. Now, I guess the important point is that these practices are not necessarily visible. And I guess by making these sorts of practices more visible to key policy stakeholders, the research, we hope, can contribute to a biosecurity system that's more responsive to pests and diseases that threaten potentially Australia's food security. The second area around program implementation and practice adoption is oriented much more at the micro level, micro scale of governing, focused on techniques and technologies aimed at improving the sustainability of farming practices, how those are constructed, implemented, and made workable. So just another example of a recently completed project funded by the Soil CRC, we found through conducting quite a range of farmer workshops and interviews with local farming groups and advisors around Australia that farmers are actually engaging much more extensively than what's often assumed with soil health practices. Now, it's often assumed that the reason why farmers don't engage more extensively is because of their attitudes and behaviours. Our research is really questioning that by showing that the real issues holding back adoption are things such as lack of resourcing to assist farmers in interpreting the meaning of soil data, limited recognition of farmers' experiential knowledge, and also some tensions between farmers' ethic of caring for the land and the imperative to run a viable farming enterprise. And I was really struck by, Joseph, your comment about around solution-oriented sociology. What we're trying to do, what we were trying to do with this project is to use some of this data to help inform future soil CRC projects, as well as help to inform the development of a revised national soil strategy, which is currently in draft form. So there's some interesting prospects there.
Thank you. I can't believe how many notes I've already written down just from the introductions. So I'd also just maybe encourage everyone, if you want to have a question, put it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as well as drive this conversation. So I think what's really clear is that all of you are working in quite diverse fields and need to make various types of connections. So I was just kind of wondering what kind of connections or partnerships have you formed, and how have you gone about making those connections and partnerships?
Wow, that's a great question. That's so important to me, because I really do use that community development model of not one voice is not the expert, but having a community of voices for me is so important, because everybody has something to offer, and in working especially collectively in groups. And one of the things that I'm really falling in love with is co-design, which really does give that real voice to people who I want to ensure that there is a change for services and make sure people can have access to resources, to kind of have that space to say, well, what are my needs? How do we get there? What can we do? And then I take a back seat and I allow the whatever group of people I'm working with, whether it be trans students or whether it be within the Black Greens or people living with disabilities, I kind of allow them to frame where they want to go, and then make sure that the resources and services are there. So for me, it's always, people, I must admit, I'm in love with Foucault, his idea of power and the way everything can filter around. But also I keep saying it, whose voices are being heard, who's not being heard, and how do we disrupt that kind of structurally inequality imbalances that have been embedded, in governance, to allow people to have a voice. So for me, it's always having colleagues too that I can talk back with and say, what do you think of this approach? How am I going to get the best action? So for me, sociology gives me an understanding of the systems I'm working with. And then within sociology, I look at practices, ways in which I can ensure that the people that I'm working with have the skills and the tools to enact the change. So I don't know if I've answered that question in a way, but for me, it's always about making sure that people who I'm working with have the opportunity to see how they can have a place within society and then have some control and decision-making governance to enact change.
So it sounds like to me, Ricky, you're kind of, or you're talking about that co-production element, but it's also a case of talking about being a facilitator for those things to potentially also happen as well, to have those voices, and you being a facilitator to help that while using your sociology.
Absolutely. And then I guess having some ideas of writing a paper together to then impart that wisdom and that knowledge that has developed as a result of that dynamic energy that's taken place, and then share it with the whole community. So that's what I love about sociology, because we're very much a discipline where we share our information, our research with other colleagues, so that we all, you know, whether we're working in agriculture, whether we're working in health sociology or educational sociology, we thread through ways that connect, and we always want to make sure everyone's voices are being heard.
Yeah, I might jump in there. There's a fair bit of crossover with what Ricky was saying with some of the methodological tools that we use. We do a lot of co-design work with a whole bunch of different groups of people. It's been quite interesting this year where there's a lot of focus on economic recovery out of COVID. And so we're looking at particular regions and growth industries in those places. And it takes you to forming connections with groups that you never would have anticipated. So we're running these systemic design workshops with people in transport and logistics. You learn all this stuff about hauling trucks. We're working closely with the dairy industry. And I think, as Vaughan was saying, you know, there's real potential there when people, industry leaders, can see a real need for radical reform in their sector and their industry. And I think for us, it's about being prepared to apply theories and tools to give shape to some of that vision, and then provide a way to actually enact that, you know, to have these kind of mechanisms to make connections with policymakers, and to present not just a particular policy objective or goal or campaign for something, but to actually present to policymakers, this is how you should do it. When you have that design work, in terms of engaging other people and stakeholders, it's much more compelling. And I think this is one of the questions we've got for this session. You know, how do you achieve these connections? We work closely with people in government. Obviously, we work with ministerial advisors, DepSecs, public sector managers, as well as practitioners, as well as other academics. And when we're talking about this particular methodology, what becomes really clear is the work that has to happen up front around bringing people along to a very high ambition for radical reform. And that's really difficult work. And it's difficult because, one, we're not really trained to do that, I think. We're not sort of trained in that sort of interpersonal work to bring people along to a big ambition. And secondly, you're often dealing with people, the people that I've just mentioned, who for various reasons are pretty invested in keeping things the way that they are. So reframing problems becomes really important, but then how do you bring people on to champion that work, to take it back to their department, to their minister, and start proposing the need for change and how you do it. So there's a lot of longer horizon work in the work that we do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd like to jump off of what Joseph said, particularly the interpersonal aspect that Joseph talked about. And I guess I prepared two stories, one from an early career researcher perspective and one from a mid-career researcher perspective on my own journey with reaching out and creating networks. And I guess if I can provide the interpersonal aspect, if that's helpful for people seeking to make connections outside of academia. So just to place me again, I work in healthcare, and I've got connections nationally and internationally in the various aspects of healthcare that I'm interested in researching from a research point going forward into application in healthcare. And I guess both these stories have some core principles that I really wanted to highlight in this presentation. And one of them is the connection between hard work and fortuitous happenings, if you like. So both of my stories have this fortuitous moment aspect to them. But when I reflected on these stories, I realized that it was as a result of putting myself out there, being brave and going towards the area and the people that I was hoping to connect with. So the first one is, as an early career researcher, I wanted to reach out into the world of human milk banking and breast milk donation. And so after reading the literature, I decided to go to an international conference. And so off I went into the US, and I was browsing one of the stalls, you know, the information booths, if you like, at the conference. And a person who was happening to be there asked me what I was doing there, and we struck up a conversation. And he said, "Oh, you have an accent, you're a long way from home." "Yes, I am. I'm Australia. What brings you here?" And I said, "Well, look, I'm really interested in researching this area. I'm looking for clinical partners." And he said, "Well, I might be able to help you. You know, what do you need?" And I said, "Well, actually, I need a field site in which to do some pilot work." And he said, "Well, funnily enough, I've just introduced donor human milk into my neonatal intensive care unit, and we're really interested to see how it's being received. Would you like to do a survey for us to understand staff perspective?" "Oh," I say, "sure, of course." I went there not thinking I want to do a survey. That's not necessarily my area of expertise. But the point is through being open and being accountable and saying, "Oh, I'll give it a go," and starting to join this collaboration, we went forward from there. We did a small survey. It was useful. I proved my stripes as a researcher, as a sociologist, and then I was provided with a field site in which to conduct ethnographic research that I was able to write into a grant and say, "Here's my clinical partner, here's my field site, here's our track record of collaboration," etc. And so then that connection opened up to other connections in the US. And so connections build connections, if you like. So you could say, well, that was very lucky that you were standing there at the right time, and it certainly was. But I think being authentic to who you are and what you want to do, and putting yourself out there as a sociologist actually really helps build those connections. So that was my first, I guess, real moment of post-PhD launching into the applied space. But then fast forward about nine or 10 years, and this happened a few years ago. I was looking for my second grant idea for the Australian Research Council, again to work in the applied space. And I was returning home from Melbourne on a domestic flight with a baby on my knee, and I had a very understanding passenger sitting next to me, and they said, "Well, where are you doing? What are you doing? Where are you going? What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm interested in this. This is what I'm doing." And we had a genuine, caring and authentic conversation. It so happened that his mother worked with the Dean of Education here, the Dean of Medicine here at ANU, who was also the Chief Neonatologist at the Canberra Hospital. And through facilitating introductions, I managed to land in front of someone with a lot of power and connections in the health system on this particular topic. And I went there with my grant idea and I met her. We had a good discussion. I then went away and wrote the grant, got the grant, and turned up in her office a year later saying, "Okay, we've got the money, let's go." And again, she commented when she was introducing me into other connections within the field of medicine, health, saying, "This is someone who came to me with an idea, went away, did the work, and came back." And I think it really helps to have that, as I said, fortuitous connections of connections, but also working hard in the background and demonstrating your expertise to be able to be taken seriously, I guess, as you go forward into this space that can be a little bit unknown, a bit opaque, a little bit scary, etc. And I guess the interpersonal again that I wanted to touch on with regards to Joseph, I think in feeling my way with applied work, definitely seeking and feeling synergy is something really important, is going away and reflecting, are we headed in the same direction, or is this going to be a lot of hard work that is probably going to be more labour than results, if you like. And so definitely trying to find people who are willing to toe the load in the same direction as you, whether it's with a complementary barrow or in the same barrow, but definitely reflecting on that synergy is really important, because it's hard work and you want to get momentum, if you like.
I'm going to follow Catherine, and particularly the issue around hard work. So I guess one thing about me is my academic track. So I'm a late goer, 26 years of age. I start university, I work internationally in international aid, and then, in Australia when I come back in service provision, and I go from finishing an undergrad to a master's to doing a PhD whilst working largely full-time or significant part-time hours throughout this process. So I guess for me, there's always been the possibility about doing applied work. Like, it's one of the reasons that I actually went from a master's to a PhD, because I thought, oh, this is really interesting. We're doing these changes. The government's recommending that we do this. It doesn't seem to be working. Why don't we understand it? Why don't we understand what's going on? So I have a very different track into the university. And I think one of the things that happened to me was a little bit unusual, is when I got offered a secondment in Western Australia to join the Centre for Human Rights Education, because I was actually working in policy, and they said one of our staff members going to on a sabbatical for a year. We want to do some disability programming. Can you come and do that for us for a year? So I applied for a secondment. I got it, went across, and when I was there, what happened really was that people came to me to ask me, a number of disability advocacy groups came and asked me to join their boards and to apply my research skills that way. And I think this really, for me, comes back to what Catherine was talking about, is work. Especially if we're working in civil society area, is acknowledging that often, these groups are extremely underfunded. So if they're giving us their time and we're asking for meetings with them, for me, one of the things that it does result in further work, but it's really about, so what are you delivering for them? And, this comes back to Joseph's earlier thing about, solutions. If you're not bringing solutions, but how are you, if the aspect of work is really, really important, because what you're actually doing in the applied space is actually building trust. And, when people see that you work hard and you're listening, and you're producing, it could just be a community report that has no academic value to your own career. People understand that you're actually committed to the work that they're going to do, and you want to drive, you want to support their efforts to change the system and not necessarily dictate. So this is one thing that I think, coming from a non-academic background, which has really helped me to build good networks, is I guess one of my strengths, is I don't necessarily suggest that I'm going to have an opinion because I'm a researcher. So because I've come from an applied space and looked to researchers to help me sort through, and now I'm on the other side, I think that is one of the key interpersonal skills about being self-reflective and being open and deep listening about where people want to go with this and how they understand it. And so part of the building the networks and building those relationships and how to strengthen those is thinking about not just your own sociological paradigm, but what kind of new areas within sociological frames do you need to go into to actually support what these organisations are trying to do, or to identify what the problems are. And I think for me, coming back to that interpersonal work that Catherine was just talking about, is that it's the coupling of work, the interpersonal capacity, but also, I guess, you know, being open to other possibilities. And rather than saying, well, you know, I'm the researcher and I've got all of this training, you know, like I've got 4 degrees all done part-time whilst working and so forth. I mean, that's a lot of degrees. You know, I could say that I'm the expert, but actually what, you know, because I come from the applied space, for me, it's been really important to identify researchers who are open when I was working to the possibility of other ways of thinking about that problem. And I guess that for me has been one of the things that I've tried to do now that I'm a researcher, in working the other way. And I think it's that interpersonal skill plus doing work in a way that produces something of interest to them beyond, you know, just my own academic gain. So, you know, with all my Category 1 grants, one thing I always make sure I do is have a report for the organisations that I've worked with. You know, that report doesn't have academic value in the way that we understand academic value, but it actually has a value for them. And, you know, even technically under Category 1 grants, you don't need to do that work technically, but this is about a reciprocal relationship with your partners. And this is really, it's that additional work beyond the academic sphere, I think, what Joseph and Catherine were talking about is really the critical component in building relationships, and people can actually see that you're prepared to do that work.
Peter, can I just jump in and sort of draw some threads there with the question in the chat, I think from James. So James asks about how you avoid state and corporate capture. And I think it's a really, really relevant question at the minute. A lot of people scrambling for funding, you know, academics themselves are in fairly precarious positions, and you're always looking for the next thing where that's going to come from. He gives the example of applying for a government fund, encouraging multicultural community empowerment, but the funding is actually tied to countering violent extremism goals. I think I know that line of funding as well. And we've had sort of similar experiences in the work we do. And I think it is about a lot of what I think Karen and Catherine just mentioned around synergy, the interpersonal. There's some sociological work on the social conditions of resonance, which I think is potentially interesting in this space as well. Where we've put in for funding, where we haven't really done that work, and we think we've got a good idea that fits the sort of terms of reference, we put it in. One recently got knocked back, and we had a look at the ones that did get up, and you go, oh, okay, so they're just sort of, that's exactly what government would be looking for, sort of more of the same. And the lesson out of that for us is when we don't do the groundwork with people in the department, when we don't engage them around the kind of problem framing, the critique, bringing them along that journey that something actually needs to change, and here's how you change it. We've got this idea. We just need a bit of funding to test it out, potentially scale it up, or use it to redesign policy. That work is actually really critical in getting around some of these questions of being captured by government. because what you want to do is you want to get in early and shift those terms of reference, right? And where we've been successful, we have seen in terms of reference the kind of problem framing, the kind of solutions that we have come up with through our own research, often through our work with practitioners. Often there's years of this work that builds up, and then you see it in those terms of reference and in those conditions. So we do a lot of front-end work to make sure we're not just chasing funding, and we never do work just for the sake of it, I guess is what I'm saying. That's not what we're here for. We're not here necessarily to just further our careers either. There's a very clear line here around why we're doing this work. And I think what Catherine said around being able to reflect on whether you are resonating or engaging people is such an undervalued skill. We spend so much time talking about this. We have a meeting with an advisor, someone in the department, someone who, a CEO of a community organization. We have a big discussion afterwards. Often it's about, are they up for the change? Are they up for this journey? If they're not, you know it's going to be a long road, and maybe you have to look elsewhere, or maybe you need to think about how you pitch and reframe. Maybe you don't go as hard with a critique on neoliberalism because you realize, oh, that really puts people off because they're the ones that are reproducing neoliberalism, and maybe we need to think about our strategy there. So we're constantly having these discussions, and I think sociology does give you a good grounding for that, but there's a whole practice to it, I think, that's sort of kind of hidden.
Can I just quickly jump in there, if that's okay, Peter, and going on with Joseph said, one thing that I've learned in the last 2 years and coming later in life into doing a really strong advocacy is really working with a multidisciplinary team, people who are really good at writing funding reports, like writing to address certain criteria within the terms of reference. And that's, to me, important too. But also for myself, and I've mentioned it in the chat too, because from a lot of the work I do is voluntary, and because I'm really passionate about giving to the community, I always ensure I get involved with projects that align with my own values. And that to me is important, because if I'm approached or I look through the terms of reference and I see that does not fit well with my worldview, or that the government or whatever peak funding body is really aligning itself because they want, as was mentioned, they're looking for some sort of element as terrorism, or especially when I work in the trans health space, I have to feel comfortable and believe in that. And I like to surround myself with people who also believe that they genuinely want to make some change. And as Joseph has just mentioned, for me, it's not about personal gain. It's not about hierarchy, oh, this is what I've done. I try to put myself in the back end space and lift and support people coming from the community, especially working with people living with disabilities who previously have not had that chance and opportunity to enact change and flourish. So for me, it's always critical. I look at the terms of reference and I think to myself, now, if I go to bed tonight, am I going to be comfortable with what I'm producing is genuinely what it strives to do? And if I can't feel 100% comfortable, I walk away, because I don't want to contribute to more structurally inbuilt systems, not allowing more people to access services and resources. And that's, for me, how I found sociology has really helped me for over the years, looking at from Marx, going back to Foucault, going to Bourdieu, all these great ideas to help me come to my realization, yes, this is a great project. It has potential. And, as a teacher, and I'm always telling people, click and copy and click, keep all your files, build them up, because sometimes the words are power, and the power of using the right language to influence and get things over the line is so important, because that's what governments in their agencies and panels that go through do with the highlighter. They're going, yes, this has addressed that. So that's my response. Sorry, Peter.
No, that's good. That's good, Ricky. Thank you. Vaughan, you haven't talked for a while, so I think we'll let you come in.
That's okay. And look, Ricky's points there, I think, paved the way really nicely for what I'm about to say. But look, just very briefly, I guess, in response to what people have been talking about, I agree with everything that has been said for sure. I think that in terms of accessing funding, the comment about with regards to avoiding capture by government or corporate interests, I think that we need to confront those head on. And I believe that just building on what Ricky just said, language can be powerful, and the way that we write our grant applications, I guess this does take some experience writing them sufficiently broadly to engage with the funding priorities, but also to ensure enough space for you to do what you think is important. So I guess in a way that we use that to play the game, but we also use that in a way to, I guess, identify practices and possibilities that we can use to make those practices that may not otherwise be visible more visible to the powers that be. So I think you need to work with the system to be able to change it. It's really, really important. I guess getting back to some of the previous points that were made, I'm going to be really original here and use Catherine's framing of hard work versus fortuitous happenings. And I think that's an absolutely fantastic framing, by the way. I guess in terms of my own work, that fits what I've done quite well. So in terms of the first aspect of hard work, quite a few years ago now, when I was first getting into doing research on biosecurity, I just moved to a new institution, and I was looking for like-minded people who could be interesting or helpful collaborators. And I ended up meeting, just by chance, a veterinary epidemiologist who is probably to this day being one of my closest research collaborators and connections. Now, when we first met, I knew almost nothing about veterinary epidemiology, probably still don't. She knew nothing about sociology. I think she probably knows a bit more now, which is good. And that connection has been very productive because, again, I was a qualitative researcher, she's largely quantitative. We were able to work, we were able to actually complement each other's expertise and skills really, really well. And working with her was quite valuable because it introduced me to a whole wide range of networks in government and industry that I would not previously had access to, or I would have had to work incredibly hard to build trust and legitimacy as a sole sociologist. So gaining that, I guess, credibility and legitimacy by using, I shouldn't say using, that's a terrible word, by collaborating with people in other disciplines, I think is enormously important. I know that point has already been made by others. So working with her, we were able to successfully get grants through Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. She had excellent connections through Animal Health Australia, who have been absolutely fantastic in terms of being brokers, introducing us to further networks, and also working with a number of industry bodies, such as we did a project a couple of years ago through Australian Eggs, and that was, that's all been really helpful. Along the way, that collaboration has also meant that we've obviously published together. I've published in journals which I never thought I would ever publish in, and which I'd never even heard of, such as Preventive Veterinary Medicine, of all places. And she's she's co-published with me in sociology journals. So it's been really quite mutually beneficial. Now, I should add, and probably people are wondering, well, how has all that been hard work? Well, when I first met my collaborator, that did take quite a bit of time to build that trust, to build that credibility, because as I said, she knew nothing about sociology. So it's something that you really have to work with. But I guess, as others have pointed out, it's really important to be open to possibilities. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But by doing that, I think you open yourself up to a whole range of different perspectives that can really enrich your whole approach, and really not so much change your worldview, but certainly constantly challenge it and enable you to adapt it in certain ways. In terms of fortuitous happenings, I've probably got one good example of this, which was, again, quite a few years ago now, one day I was sitting in my office and I got a phone call from one of my ex-PhD supervisors who I hadn't heard from for quite some time. As it turned out, she was the CEO of the Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation, which is now AgriFutures Australia. And she said, Vaughan, I've been talking to the rice research manager here, and he wants a project done on social factors that influence technology uptake in the rice industry, and they would like a social researcher. Are you interested? And I kind of and said, oh, look, I'm pretty busy at the moment, and had a bit of a think about it. And I got back to her later and said, yeah, look, I'll go to Canberra and meet with him and have a discussion. Best decision I've ever made. Because it's been, it was a really interesting project, got to meet some fascinating people. I knew nothing about the Australian rice industry, got to really blow apart a whole lot of assumptions around how rice is grown in Australia, which I'm still able to engage productively with people about to this day. And it's been a really important source of publications as well. And look, I hope that through that work, it's made a difference to how the Rice Research Program think about their research program as well. But look, I'll leave it there.
I think one thing that we've really been talking about now is kind of working across disciplines and across teams and building those capacities and partnerships. So I think one thing that would be really interesting to hear as well is, we've heard some of the opportunities, but are there challenges in that as well?
I might speak to that. We talk about this a lot at the Brotherhood. So we often hold ourselves up in the youth team as having a very close working relationship with the services or the service development team in the same organisation. We use this term, we work hand in glove, but in reality, I also say that sometimes it's like an itchy, annoying glove that you just kind of want to take off sometimes. And it kind of really speaks to this way of collaborating. I think, as Vaughan said, where you've got different perspectives, and the value of that is when you're challenged, really. And we refer to this as a productive tension, because we come from different disciplines and we're trying to find this middle ground, and often we're at odds. And it's really about long-term building trust, as Karen has mentioned, but it's also about really, as much as possible, getting on the same page with that shared ambition. If you've got that, that's really the place to start from. And I think you do have to be open. I think what's very different coming out of academia is that there's identity work to do working in the applied space. And there is that openness. I think, Karen, you mentioned it. You have to be open. You have to be open to learning, to realizing that, oh, okay, this is not about who the smartest person in the room is. It's who can actually move things forward. And very often that's not going to be you. It's going to be you in relation to a group of people that are doing the work. So for me, that kind of those collaborative challenges are very often a good sign. You want to see that. Sometimes you walk away from a meeting or a workshop and everyone feels good, but then nothing happens. Sometimes there needs to be that agitation, I'd say.
Can I just jump in and add to it? That's okay. 3 areas from my life that I'm really heavily involved in, and all kind of have their own unique issues. One is working in the Indigenous space and really being mindful and careful that sometimes with research and funding, people may have good intentions and think, we want to get people, we want to make sure there's, say with COVID, is a good example. We want to make sure everyone is vaccinated and well. But sometimes through that process, you can really lose sight of the fact that it really needs engagement from the way the groups or the people you're working with, the best way forward. And one of that is, talking to elders within the community, making sure you have people on board to understand and use language, unpack that worded language into a language that is understood by the people that, that you're trying to work with and take on that journey. And if you don't do that, then it does cause conflict and problems. And also being authentic, if you're going to be running a project that's impacting and changing people's lives, you really do have to have people that are the ones who are being impacted, involved from the top level through governance, being able to say, yes, we are okay with this. No, this does not work for us. Because if you don't have that, all you're really doing is just kind of reinforcing what's already there, and having, I always say white privilege, speaking for the rest. It doesn't do it good. We need to have action that is genuinely and within the language from the group, from the power. Same with my work with disabilities. I know I'm proud that I live with my disabilities, and I'm always looking for ways of disrupting ableism. And in some ways in the past, academia has been ableist because you have to be able to write a certain way, be able to frame it, and how much rejections I have had putting stuff to academic journals and saying, no, got to rewrite. And it does hurt, but I think to myself, thank God I have the cognitive capacity to take that on and do it. But then I think of my colleagues and friends who maybe have more profound disabilities, and how am I going to help shape that? How am I going to support that their voices and actions are heard and it's genuine? So I'm always looking for ways to, how do I empower whoever I'm working with to make sure that it's not about the journey of just doing the project per se of the project, but it's enacting authentic, real change. And that's the one thing I always take away from my sociological ideas underpinning everything I do, right back to theories of deviancy, when I work in trans health spaces. Is this going to make change? Is this going to be a genuinely process that's going to enable people who are most disadvantaged to have a pathway that will enable something good to happen? And if I can't feel that, I then think to myself that I'm not the best person. And as Joseph said, my skills in IT are not the best, but I love speaking with people. So I sit myself there, but I surround myself with people who are great at timekeeping, great at IT, great at proofreading my work, getting rid of my spelling mistakes. And if you surround yourself with like-minded people who have different skill sets, you can get everything done. And, like through my work with Sociology Media, it's a quick plug with my Voices series, that there's 55 videos that people can watch of people I interview throughout Australia. The common thread of every single interview I've done has been the passion that comes from within. People genuinely want to help their community. Thank you for listening.
I've got to say, I heard you very loudly and clearly, Ricky, about the ableism that exists in higher education, but also I would say social institutions more broadly. As an academic that has a disability, I understand completely where you're coming from. Karen, I noticed you taking lots of scrawling. Was there something that you wanted to jump in and say?
Yeah, well, I really wanted to talk about, I mean, for me, one of the challenges is, you know, in working in the applied space is this role, you know, we're expected to wear all these hats, and one is an expert, one is a facilitator. And also this conversation that often happens a lot is capacity builder. So, you know, often organisations, especially small organisations, what they're doing is, you know, they want your expertise. They also want to use that expertise to facilitate, you know, problem identification and possible solutions. But also they're also really often, in my experience anyway, has been, you know, people asking you to build their capacity around, and, you know, this is part of the research process, but in an applied situation, it's much more apparent where you're actually building the capacity of the people that you're working with to understand, you know, sociological theory and how we think about this issue, and also how that could apply in so many different ways within their contextual setting, and the different kinds of methods we could use. I mean, I think Catherine's work around the video narratives and so forth, like, that's really exciting work. And, you know, part of, there's a level of work there of you not just doing that work, but an expectation that you will develop staff's capacity to undertake that work. And I guess part of that is also this, one of the final challenges for me is knowing and accepting when it's time to leave and when it's over. And, you know, I think that's the other thing about these applied relationships is, you know, often they have an exit strategy. They've brought you in for a particular time to understand a particular problem, and they want to understand it in a particular way. And they want you, that's why they've brought you in, and they really want you to develop their capacity to a certain point where they don't necessarily need you to that degree anymore about that problem. And so I think there's all these competing tensions that are happening for you as an academic researcher. And I think the big one really is understanding when it's an invitation and what is that invitation actually for, that, you know, the expectation around what it is that they want you to do. You know, is it actually about producing knowledge about the specific problem, or is it actually about facilitating their learning about the problem? And, you know, that is a major tension. And then with that is, when is it time to leave? And how do you listen for these people to say, you know, we think we've got this now, you know, see you later, you know, we'll reach out when we need you. So how do you handle those exit transitions as well? Yeah, so I think for me, they're the primary, some of the primary tensions that are going on there. Our multiplicity of roles and understanding invitation for entry and, you know, invitation to leave is, I guess, the nice way to say, see you later, we don't need you anymore.
I think those are excellent points, Karen, and look, just building on those, I guess one of the biggest challenges that I've found is working in an interdisciplinary space is when you working with scientists can be very rewarding, but it can be one of the most frustrating things that you'll ever have to face because not wanting to put people off, of course, but it can be frustrating in the sense, especially if you're a qualitative researcher, everything is interpreted through the frame of quantitative research. And also social research can sometimes, or I shouldn't say sometimes, often be reduced to a form of social marketing. So you're brought in as the as sociologists who it's assumed will help to sell a particular idea or a product that will and then enable that to be more widely adopted. And I think that's the case too when you're dealing with policymakers and people from industry. They want to see the numbers. And it comes back to how you position yourself as a researcher. I think it helps when you're working with colleagues who do have that expertise with quantitative data, but I think it also is important to you really sort of have to think about how you position yourself and how you, I guess, sell the research that you want to do. Otherwise, you'll quickly lose people's attention, and they'll then obviously think that you have not all that much to contribute. So it's a really a way of trying to, I guess, to tell people how not to suck eggs, because it's all about you want to tell them from your research, you want to tell them something which they think they don't already know. So it's all about very careful positioning and framing of that, I think. I guess the other point I would make too, and this is a very pragmatic concern, is when you're working with government and industry, often you find there's challenges in maintaining or connect those connections over time, because especially once the project comes to an end, there's frequent turnover of staff in these agencies and organisations. There's internal movements of staff within the agencies, and so that makes it really, really difficult to keep track of people. So you might have spent all this time building up credibility and trust with one or two people. When they move on and someone else comes into that position, they might not be as sympathetic to social research. They will not know who you are necessarily, and you have to begin the whole process again. So that can be incredibly frustrating. Unfortunately, I don't really have any helpful solutions to that. It's just, I think it's just one of the things that we have to face as sociologists. Thanks.
Yeah, I hear that, Vaughan, because I'm in talking about working with people in the aged care space. Of course, there's a high turnover of staff within aged care, and so that can make it hard to maintain those relationships, but it means that you're constantly looking for ways to make connections or relationship build all the time. Catherine, I'm really conscious that because you also have this connection in with the healthcare system and healthcare professionals, how do you find working with those potential tensions that may come up?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I've so enjoyed listening to panelists on this topic, actually. I've been thinking about, to add sort of an optimist perspective with all of this, I've been really thinking about a sociology of medicine, a sociology in medicine, and a sociology with medicine, if you like, borrowing on those terms. And what, in my experience, it's been in terms of shifting your positionality within that spectrum. It can happen across projects. For example, one particular project, you might be brought in with terms of reference that is very much medically derived, and your box is already largely formed. And I'll speak to that in a second. And then there's another one when you're brought in and it's a true synergistic relationship where the emergence and the respect for both sides of the expertise and disciplinary orientations are truly there, and you don't know where you're going to go, but it's this beautiful feeling of flight, which I'm sure many of you have experienced. And then there's this idea of sort of this sociological critique coming from the outside and being very careful to how to dish out that critique, if you like, without stepping on toes and burning relationships and seeming like an out of touch outsider. So you're always shifting in these roles, if you like, and you can get that with projects, but I believe that with ongoing trustful relationships that are very much a slow burn over many, many years, you have shifting positions within the same relationship or within the same project. And that's okay. You move with the times, you move with the relationships, you move with where things are going, and you know your moment. You might be brought in within very strict terms of reference, but after that trust has been built, and they're ready to hear what you have to say, if you frame it in a way that you know is appropriate for the culture and the relationships and the organisation that you've come to know, you can actually be quite radical, quite critical, offer quite transformative ideas, or go to new policies, etc., in a way that you never thought was possible at the outset in terms of the frame that you're given to work with. An example of that in terms of, I think we were asked to think of something where you sort of crash and burn a little bit, or a bad news story. I haven't had many, thankfully, but there's one that I'd like to recount, which is if you go back to my first story about flying to America and attending this conference and meeting a very open physician who was really interested in sociology and ethnography and qualitative research. I had another very powerful physician who was sort of interested, and I followed that relationship up upon returning to Australia. And what I really needed from this particular physician was a letter to accompany my grant submission saying that she supported my application, that would work with me. And her email was very harsh for, you know, straight out of your PhD and your first time putting yourself out there. So I don't give letters of recommendation easily. Right, okay. Never mind. I had another avenue to, which was like a 10-year beautiful collaboration of publications and transformative change in healthcare, which was a wonderful experience, building on Vaughan's also top, you know, conversation about your prolonged collaboration with someone from another discipline. Anyway, I just received an email this week saying from that person who said to me, I don't give letters of recommendation, I'm sorry, you stay over there in your sociology box. She said, look, I love your work on lactation after loss. Will you come speak to our group in lactation, in our breastfeeding coalition in San Diego, et cetera, et cetera. And now she's ready to hear the message. Now she is embracing the message. And that relationship was never truly burnt. I just went with the synergy. But of course, as Kaz Cook says, what is it? Keep yourself nice, don't burn bridges. That relationship was able to be maintained over 10 years. And here we are being asked to provide an hour-and-a-half webinar to countless physicians in San Diego on lactation after loss. So my point being that you adopt different positionalities within projects, across projects with different people, and just be open to things shifting with time and shifting as a result of the relationships you build and people's readiness to hear certain things, and you yourself also to hear certain things from others.
Yeah, I love that story, Catherine. And to me, that's also part of the patience of doing research and part of the patience of building relationships and connections with people as well. I'm conscious of the time, that we've got about 10 minutes left. So if anyone in the audience does have questions, please put them in the chat. But one thing I thought would be really great to ask all of you are the ways that your research activities, your advocacy activities, how are they having impact, or how are they being translated?
I'll try and answer quick, Peter. I would say all of our work. I don't think I'd be in a job if we weren't doing that. So maybe I'll focus in on scale in answering this question, the scale of impact. So we work at all levels, and sometimes we start with pretty small scale bits of work. We might be asked to review a bit of policy. We might be asked to evaluate a program, and this has happened most recently with some work we're doing in Tasmania with the Tasmanian government. And what's born out of that, when we start doing that review, we start critically looking at, what's the problem here? We present a much bigger vision. We go, actually, it's not just about this one program, or what this one program is telling us is that there's some wider state reform that needs to happen. And this has happened with some work where we're currently reforming and informing the recommissioning of their housing and homelessness system. So that starts off the back of just a policy review. Similarly, in that same state as well, we're doing a small evaluation on a program, their targeted youth services program, but we're using that as the opportunity to shine a lens on their whole system, where the gaps are, what's working, what's not working. And so often our impact can be seeded from fairly small things, but it's how you bring people along so that they can see that there is a need. And if they're up for it, a need for much bigger, more impactful reform. But the work is really, and I think just off the back of that discussion, the work is really difficult because, as Catherine was saying, you know, you're looking for that moment where things are just flying, but you have to be pretty reflexive about your position. So I think, Peter, as you would know, you know, when you have a mainlander coming to Tasmania telling people what they should do, then straight off the bat, that's not going to work, right? And then you've got me, sort of someone from NAM, kind of looking the way I do, talking about theory, talking about, you know, how you need to change things, what the problem is. That's not going to work. And so I had to quickly adapt that after several, we call them communities of practice, and not really making much headway. And then I had to really switch things up. And I'm still learning around that. Working remotely in lockdown, trying to get people onto, I think, Ricky, you mentioned sort of there's forms of technology. And I'm like, oh, great, let's do these workshops online. Let's use Miro boards and all of it. And it just, some of this stuff just crashes and burns big time. And then you have to rebuild that trust. You have to, you know, start from, so it's just constant. But when you get to that point where it does, seeing that collaboration works, you can see the impact happening. For us, it's knowing that at the other end of this, okay, people will have better access to services. The system, there will be lasting change in a system that can at least shift the resources in a much more effective way so that young people get the support, or people in precarious housing get the support at the right time, and that it builds their capability so that they've got an aspiration that sits outside of these systems, actually, all the stuff that we take for granted. So that's when we know we're doing, you know, the good work.
Can I just quickly jump in and say one of the projects I worked on earlier this year was getting the community within the Maribyrnong area of Melbourne to have an inclusive presence within the local council. And I kind of put it out there, did a few video blogs on Facebook, and got around 50 people from the Maribyrnong Council who are part of the LGBTIQ community to come together, and I formed a group to lobby the council so that we would have a social inclusion committee. And I really loved it, and I took that through the journey of about 5 months, and then I left the group because I thought my role was just to bring people together, and I knew that within their group there were leaders, there were speakers, there was potential people that had a lot to offer. And I felt I was so blessed. I thought, you know what, I thought to myself, wow, this is the journey. The group will now take on its life, and people from within that space can develop it further. And I really love what Karen said. It's about knowing your space and invitation to come and to go. And that's one of the core things I love about community development within sociology, that, you know, we're not there to be there all the time and hold on to a position. We're there to give. And it's like once you have a little caterpillar and it turns into a butterfly, you let that butterfly go. You don't keep it, because you know that that butterfly will do more letting it go, and it'll flourish and it'll bring so much love and life to the spaces. So my big message to everybody out there is really remember whose voices are being heard, and remember that give to everybody, and never put yourself in a position where, yes, you're doing something, but you know what, we all work together. Thank you.
Look, I think translation can sometimes be quite a tricky thing. I mean, I don't know how many projects I've done where you develop these reports, develop these wonderful recommendations, then you suspect that the report sits on someone's shelf and nothing really happens to it. I guess probably the most satisfying projects I've done where I'm reasonably confident that work I've done is having some kind of impact are those projects incorporating what Ricky was talking about earlier in terms of co-development and co-design. So just by way of example, the soil CRC project, which I mentioned briefly earlier, in that project we co-developed with 7 mixed farming groups from around Australia a diagnostic and a social learning framework for these groups to work through to determine which innovations and practices for improved soil management are likely to be adopted across the different farming system and geographical contexts in which these groups are working. So we basically developed a tailored adoptability framework for each group. We workshopped that framework with them. They were able to make changes to it. So we hope we're pretty confident that will actually be used, because those farming groups have some sense of ownership because they actually contributed to it. And look, I think that those sorts of projects can really be the most impactful in many ways, because you can actually observe the people who are participating in your research contributing to that, and you can have some confidence that they'll then have some buy-in to that process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Warden. I think where I've enjoyed the most, satisfaction, I guess, of watching impact is where the people that I've been working with have taken the reins and really been involved in deciding what they want for their organisation or their group, etc. And that's what I love about the video reflexive ethnography work, of providing visual footage that's been collaboratively filmed, and then the collaborative sense making, getting together to discussing that, and then working out a way forward together, that often clinician-led or family-led in the clinical space. That's where the lasting changes have occurred. For example, in America, through my work with video reflexive ethnography, we managed to change hospital policy to ensure that all preterm babies were given access to donor human milk for free without parents having to pay if they needed it, as opposed to having to pay, and therefore shutting out a whole section of vulnerable babies whose parents couldn't afford to pay for donor milk. That's probably my #1 satisfaction in terms of video reflexive ethnography outcome. Also transformed ward round communication policies, surgical pathology communication policies using VRE. So that's all been satisfying. But I guess there's another way of impact for my work as well, which is a lot of speaking work. So for example, the Australian Breastfeeding Association, they've invited Debbie Noble-Carr and myself to come on their national speaking tour early next year to talk to hundreds of health professionals across Australia on the topic of lactation after loss, a research-based presentation. It's great exposure for sociology and giving voice to an issue that's otherwise often overlooked. The Australian Breastfeeding Association's take on our research and rewritten their online health information. They've written tailored fact sheets now to be provided to bereaved parents and health professionals who are looking after those bereaved parents. And a lot of that is drawing on our sociological work of looking at motherhood, challenging norms of lactation and assumptions around lactation and motherhood in grief. So yeah, I guess it's two different outputs, if you like. One which is more research-led, where people take on your recommendations, and whether you present in presentations or through the written form, versus the outcomes where people have worked with you and made decisions based on what they're doing and where they want to go, and you're just more backgrounded in that process. So yeah, it's interesting how different projects, different relationships, different methodologies produce different impacts and engagements in this applied space. And I think it's just a wonderful privilege to create these relationships and work with people in different sectors. It's a real honour.
So I think we'll finish off with hearing from Karen.
Hearing from me. Well, I don't really have much to add. Just I think the impact factor in the way I think that's particularly important. And also understanding, you know, sometimes we're doing work that might not have an impact for those communities until years down the track. And I guess, for example, the report that I talked about in the opening of BSL, you know, that draws actually on 15 years of work. It was an issue that I had identified when I was when I first returned from Australia from working overseas in conflict zones. I was working in a service. And then that kind of spurred on for me to do a master's, and then that spurred on for me to do a PhD. And so I think the other thing about thinking about our impact as sociologists is really, it is that, you know, it does have different temporal frames, which everyone has suggested along the way. And also thinking about Claire Baker's comments about scale. So often, you know, our work, especially in the early stages, can, you know, it will take a much longer period of time to generate change. But at the same time, the scale also too is much smaller. But over a period of time, I think what sociologists actually offer is the possibility of continuity in thinking about the dynamics of processes of continual change and what that actually means. And then thinking about what kind of impact this has, what Catherine was talking about as what we could achieve by having that long-term engagement with these areas. So for me, that is really about our commitment, not just to the discipline of sociology, but often to our own areas of expertise and how we, over time, broaden out and expand our engagement with those issues. I'm not sure I answered the question there, so sorry.
No, I think it's a good way to kind of wrap up. And I think one thing that's been really lovely about this session, I mean, I've really enjoyed hearing from everyone, but I think the other lovely thing is that even though each of you are working in different areas and working with different communities, I think there's a real pattern here around that importance of co-production, about valuing different voices, about not coming in as presenting yourself as an expert, but rather as part of a team of voices that can work together towards hopefully achieving good ends for everyone. So I'll have to draw this session to a close. I feel like we could keep talking for a while longer, but I'll have to draw it to a close. And so if everyone can just virtually thank the presenters with me, that would be great. Thank you so much.